Hello and welcome to another YouTube video on my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about John Locke and his text, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, from the Personal Identity Unit of 3-4 Philosophy. The only pre-knowledge you need for Locke is you need to understand that personal identity asks the question, what makes me the same person over time? And there are two popular theories for this, and the first one is the soul makes me the same person over time, and two, the body is what makes me the same person over time. Locke disagrees with both the soul theory and the body theory, and he actually says that consciousness is what makes somebody the same person over time. And consciousness in Locke's account means memory, so memory is what makes somebody the same person over time. Make sure that you're writing consciousness is what makes someone the same person over time, but it's just easier to understand when you think about how memory is what he means by consciousness. So Locke begins his text by trying to figure out what makes something the same thing over time. And he calls this the POI, which stands for Principle of Individuation. So POI is what makes something the same thing over time. And Locke thinks that there are different POIs for substances, man, and person. So I'll go through the definitions and POI for substances, man, and person, and make sure to write notes for all of this because they come back later in his thought experiments and his whole theory. So you really need to understand the definitions and POI for all three things. So we'll start with substance. Locke defines substance as a non-living thing, for example, a rock or a chair. And the POI for substance is that it has to remain physically the same over time. So any change to a substance means that it's a different thing. For example, if a chair loses a leg, then it's different. And if a rock breaks in half, then it's different. And the second one is man, and Locke defines man as a living organism, for example, an elephant or a tree. The POI for man is continuous life, so material composition can change, but the shared goal remains the same. So, for example, a seedling can grow into the tree, and it's still the same seedling or tree, it remains the same. And the last one is person. Locke defines person as a rational, self-aware, thinking being that we call me or self. And as we know, the POI for this is consciousness. So it's important to remember that when Locke says consciousness is the key to personal identity, he's referring to persons. So in regards to persons, Locke says that if actions we did in the past are done with the same consciousness that we have in the present, then it is the same personal self. Then Locke talks about physical bodies changing, and that in relation to personal identity. Locke argues that if someone loses a body part, they're still the same person because material matter can change without one's personal identity changing. And then he uses the little finger thought experiment to explain how consciousness can be lost. So the little finger thought experiment says that if a little finger is separated from the body, but it takes the consciousness of who it was a part of, then the little finger is now the self. So then the little finger would become the person, and the self that it was once attached to would have nothing to do with the rest of the body. And even though the material matter has changed completely, it still remains the same person because personal identity follows consciousness. Locke then uses the prince and the cobbler thought experiment to explain how the personal identity of persons has nothing to do with the body. The prince and the cobbler thought experiment says that if a prince and a cobbler undergo a transfer of souls, the prince now has all of the memories of the cobbler, and the cobbler now has all of the memories of the prince. So the prince is now the cobbler, and the cobbler is now the prince. So the thought experiment explains how Locke's personal identity theory is defined by consciousness and not the body. The prince and the cobbler thought experiment also explains how the POI of man, remember man is living organisms, and the POI is continuous life. He explains how the POI of man does not apply to persons. So Locke rejects the POI of man in the case of persons because he says that if we can imagine the consciousness being transferred from one soul or organism to another, and consciousness is separate from a living organism, then continuity of life does not work. So obviously, if you haven't picked it up yet, Locke explains his argument through a series of thought experiments, and there are two more that he uses to explain his theory. The third one is the Socrates asleep thought experiment. So Locke says that Socrates asleep is a different person from Socrates awake because he has a different consciousness. Locke says that if someone does not have the same consciousness that they do awake as they do asleep, despite being in the same body, they are a different person. And the last thought experiment he uses to explain a similar idea is the drunk man thought experiment. The drunk man thought experiment says that a man who killed a person when he was drunk should not be punished sober because it was a different consciousness that killed that person. But Locke says that it's understandable as to why the law still punishes him because there's no way to test consciousness. Locke says that the best way to test consciousness is honesty, and he says that inevitably God will find out the truth on Judgment Day. So to summarize, this thought experiment says that the same body, sober and drunk, are different people, so they should not be treated the same. So that's all 4 of Locke's thought experiments. So remember, that's the little finger thought experiment, the prince and the cobbler thought experiment, the drunk man thought experiment, and the Socrates asleep thought experiment. And make sure you know and understand all of these and how they actually support Locke's theory. So I'll go through now 2 of the main objections to Locke's theory. Make sure to write these down as well, because obviously you can use them if asked to outline an objection to his theory, also if you're asked to evaluate him. So the first one is the Joseph Butler objection, and he says that Locke's theory is circular. He says that consciousness of personal identity presupposes and therefore cannot constitute personal identity. So consciousness and personal identity can't exist without the other, and they both rely on each other for his argument to be true. He also says that a memory can be one demonstration of personal identity over time, but memory or consciousness is not the same as personal identity. But if asked about this in the exam, he does say that Locke's argument is circular, but you can also talk about Meredith Michaels because she also talks a lot about the Lockean circle in her text. And the second objection is the Derek Parfit objection. And he has 2 separate objections to Locke's arguments in theory. The first one is the teletransporter problem, and the second one is the fission problem. So we'll start with the teletransporter problem. So the teletransporter problem says, you go to Mars, but before you go, they scan cellular data of you and then they destroy you. And when you arrive to Mars, they reconstruct you. And you lose consciousness temporarily, but you wake up with all of the same memories. So Locke would say that you're still the same person. But now they no longer have to destroy you, and there can be a you on Mars and a you on Earth. But unfortunately, the scanner has damaged Earth U's heart and you're going to die soon. So now there are 3 yous, the original you, the scanner heart problem you, and the you that is on Mars. So Locke would say that they're all you if you have the same consciousness. But because being in different places at the same time is a different experience and therefore different memories, they could not all be you, and consciousness and memory could not determine personal identity. And Derek Parfit's second objection is the fission problem. The fission problem says a replica of you is created, an exact replica, and then both you and your replica have been cut in half and a half from each of you has been sewn together. Is this still the same person? So Locke would say that you and the replica are the same, but the 2 versions of you have different memories when they're out in the world, so therefore it makes separate people. So both the teletransporter problem and the fission problem sort of aim to discuss how the body has to have something to do with personal identity, and Locke's theory that the body and material matter has nothing to do with personal identity is flawed. So that's all of Locke's text done and the 2 main objections that you might want to discuss. So I'll just go through and give you a quick summary of everything that you should know and understand for the exam. So Locke concludes that there is a continuous self based on the continuity of consciousness, and consciousness comes about through memory. And remember to understand all 4 thought experiments, the little finger thought experiment, the prince and the cobbler thought experiment, the Socrates asleep thought experiment, and the drunk man thought experiment, and what these theories do to help prove his arguments. And for the objections, there's the Joseph Butler objection, who has the circularity argument, but remember you can also talk about Meredith Michaels for circularity of Locke's theory. And then there's the Derek Parfit objections, and he has the teletransporter problem and the fission problem. Thank you for watching.